welcome back to Chapter 18. Chapter 18 is the second chapter in Section 4. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the cost, scale of production, and break-even analysis. This chapter is somehow easy. It includes like 3 to 4 points. In this chapter, we're going to talk about the costs and their types. We're going to talk about economies and diseconomies of scale, an important concept to understand. And we're going to practice break-even chart and talk more about how to draw it. And I'll give you some tips to use in the exam related to break-even chart. So first, let's start with business costs. You know, all the businesses have costs, of course. And it's really important to know more about the business costs, because knowing the cost is like a base. It helps you to understand many other things. So if I know my cost, I can compare it to my revenue, for example. I can determine the profit, if there is any profit, and I can determine the loss, of course. I can use the cost to compare locations. So I choose between locations, between different locations. Using the cost will help me to set the prices, and this is what I saw, or we saw in marketing section. Cost is the main thing in determining the prices of goods. So in business costs, I have mainly two types. The first one is called fixed cost. The meaning of fixed cost is the cost that do not vary with output, is the cost that stays the same as the output change. Here we are talking about the cost that we usually pay regardless the amount of output. It has the name overhead costs. If you hear this word, it's the same. We are talking here about fixed costs. So examples are many. The most common examples of fixed costs are rent, salaries, insurance. All these costs, we pay them regardless the amount of output. So for example, if the business stops producing, or there is a day off, for example, we still pay rent, we still pay salaries, we still pay insurance, so we consider this as a fixed cost. The other type of cost is called variable cost. Is the cost that varies with output. Of course, it's directly related to output, so it increases as output increases. It decreases as output decreases, of course. We call them direct costs, and they are mainly labor and material. So there is the production, there will be labor and material used. If there is no production, there will be, of course, no need for labor and materials. So the total cost will give me fixed cost plus variable cost. It's clear that the total cost of the business will come from fixed cost plus variable cost. Now, what is meant by average cost per unit? The average cost per unit is simple. It's simply the cost of producing a single unit of output. So let's say I produce tables, or I produce, let's say, food, meals, any product I produce. I want to know the cost per unit, because from there, as I said, I can start comparing and setting prices and all these. So mainly, if I want to know the average cost per unit, I simply have a rule. So I have the total cost of the production. I divide it over the total output that I have, and this will generate the cost per unit. So let's say the total cost of producing tables, for example, 10 tables is 100,000, let's say, dollar over 10. So this will give me $10,000 per table. This is the unit cost. Now, economies and diseconomies of scale, as I said, an important concept to understand, because usually I use them in many other chapters. Economies of scale first. The word scale, to understand, here we are talking about scale of operations, the size of operations of the business. So economies of scale are a group of factors that will lead to a reduction in the average cost of the business as its scale increase, as its size increase. So we have this simple rule. The business operations will increase, the business will have more branches, more products, expanded business. This will lead to a reduction in cost because the business will benefit from several things, and this is what we call economies of scale. So the first one is called purchasing economies of scale. Always remember that we are talking about the scale of operations. As the business increases in size, the business will benefit from purchasing economies of scale, which is buying in bulk. And you know, when the business buys in bulk, the suppliers will offer discounts, and this is what we call bulk buying discounts. So the business will benefit from discounts, and large businesses, of course, will benefit from these because usually they can buy in large quantities. Small businesses cannot do this, so this will help to reduce the cost. Economies of scale number 2 is called marketing economies of scale. Usually the large businesses can afford buying their own vehicles. They can use them to distribute goods instead of renting them. They can make effective marketing campaigns and advertising campaigns that help them to increase their sales and the profit. So see here, as a large business, as a business that has a big scale of operations, marketing economies of scale are available, but they are not available for small businesses. The third one, financial economies of scale. Large businesses usually get large numbers or large amount of money from the banks. Of course, there will be a chance for large businesses to get a loan from the bank, to get finance from banks, because usually banks want to deal with businesses that has very big operations, since they have securities and they can secure the loans. They can simply pay back the loans easily. And of course, the business will benefit from lower interest rates because all the banks, as I said, want to offer large businesses because they are less of risk. Managerial economies of scale. Large businesses with large operations can afford hiring specialists, paying high salaries to managers and head of departments. Of course, these people will help to reduce the cost as they improve the quality of the business decisions, and of course, they help to reduce mistakes. And we know already from chapter 17 that efficiency will arise as the mistakes reduce and workers become more productive. Technical economies of scale. As the businesses specialize, as the businesses increase in size, they can afford buying latest equipments and technology. Of course, small businesses cannot afford expensive technology, but large businesses can benefit from expensive technology and can benefit from the advantages of using technology, where, of course, the business will benefit from lower cost, and also this is what we explained in chapter 17. Now, the other part of economies of scale is called diseconomies of scale, which is the opposite. So here the average cost of the business will increase as its scale of operations increase. So here we are talking about the negative part, where large businesses suffer from. So large businesses, it's true, they benefit from economies of scale, the 5 that we mentioned, but also they might suffer from diseconomies of scale, like poor communication, of course, because usually the organization is big, so there might be a poor communication between the managers and workers, or the workers. And of course, poor communication leads to poor decision making, and of course mistakes, and this will increase the business cost. Demotivation of workers, as there is no direct contact between managers and workers, and usually in large businesses, workers are like just numbers. They are not well known by their managers, so they are not well motivated, and you know this will lead to higher labor turnover and workers become less productive. Poor control over the workers. As the business grows, many departments are there, many divisions, many branches. The poor coordination will lead definitely to poor performance, and of course it will affect the business cost. So just remember that here in economies and diseconomies of scale, the good thing is in between. Like the business will try its best to control the diseconomies of scale, and at the same time will try its best to benefit from economies of scale. So here there is like a balance between economies of scale and diseconomies of scale. Okay, break even. Break even, the topic which is important in this chapter. Of course, many questions are there about break even in chapter 18. First, I have to understand the meaning of break even level of output. So when you hear the word the break-even level of output, you are talking about the amount of output, the quantity that the business must produce or sell, so that the total cost of the business is equal to the total revenue. TR stands for total revenue. TC stands for total cost. So the revenue earned from selling output equal the total cost of producing the output. So break-even level of output, I'm talking about the amount of goods, the quantity that must be produced by the business so that the total cost is equal to the total revenue. So there is a simple rule here, as you all know, that if your revenue is more than your cost, probably you will make profit. If your revenue is less than your cost, probably you are making loss. However, if your revenue is equal to your cost, we say you break even. There is no profit, there is no loss. So business managers will use a tool called break-even charts, and this break-even chart will simply tell them at what level of output this business will make profit, will make no profit, no loss, so that if they produce less, they know that they will make loss. If they produce more, they know that they will make profit. So break-even charts will show the cost, will show revenues, and details, of course, will show you how to find revenue, will show you the fixed cost, will show you the variable cost. All these are shown on the break-even chart, of course. Uses of break-even analysis or break-even charts will help you to calculate how many units you need to sell before making profit, as we said. It will show you the changes. So managers will use this tool to tell what will happen to the break-even if we increase the price, if the cost increase, if it decrease. So we can find or see effects of our decisions on the break-even analysis or chart, of course. So it will look like this. I'll just explain using an example and an exercise in a moment. Break-even analysis will look like this. As you can see, we have x-axis and y-axis. The x-axis stands for quantity and the y-axis cost and revenue. So here we have, you can see a fixed cost line, total cost, total revenue, and there is a point where two lines intersect. Of course, it's called the break-even point, and from this level to the right, the business will start making profit, and from this level to the left, the business will make loss. Of course, I'll explain it using an exercise. Okay, there is an exercise here, just to understand it quickly before we draw it together. Here we have a business that produce motorcycle tires. The following information about the business has been obtained. Fixed cost, they said $30,000 per year. Variable cost, of course, per unit, $5 per unit, like each tire costs me $5. Each tire is sold for $10. And the maximum output produced 10,000 tires per year. So all what I need to draw a break-even chart will be this. If I know the fixed cost, if I know the variable cost per unit, the selling price, and the maximum output that is produced, I can simply tell what is the break-even point of the business. In the exam, you will use this way, even if they didn't ask you. We have a way to find the break-even point without drawing a break-even chart, what we call break-even equation or contribution method equation. So this break-even method equation, simply you get the total fixed cost and you divide it by the contribution per unit, which is the selling price minus variable cost. So contribution is selling price minus variable cost. So here if we apply the rule, if you remember, the fixed cost was 30,000. Okay, and of course selling price was 10 minus 5, so 30,000 over 5, the number of units produced will be 6,000 tires per year. And 6,000 tires, the business will make no profit, no loss. 6,001, the business will start making profit. We'll illustrate this using an example. Regarding the advantages of break-even chart, also they ask about these. A break-even chart will identify the break-even point. It will tell you the maximum profit that you can make. Of course, the profit and loss at different levels of output, at any level of output you can tell. It will help you to see the changes that you make easily on the break-even chart, and this is one of the main advantages. So you can simply redraw. The break-even charts will help, as I said, in decision making and to calculate the safety of margin. Safety of margin or safety margin is also something that I can find in the break-even chart. Also, once I draw the break-even chart, I illustrate the safety margin. Break-even chart has some disadvantages. Of course, we assume break-even chart that all the goods are sold. Everything we produce is sold, and this is not the reality, of course. Fixed costs are not always fixed, so they might change. They are fixed on the short term, but they are not fixed for a long term. But we always assume that fixed costs are fixed. And break-even chart simply takes these numbers into consideration without considering many things, especially the marketing issues. They are not analyzed and they are not taken into consideration. Okay, I'll explain a break-even chart using an example. This example is found on page 228 in your book. It's a business, a sports shoe business. It has a fixed cost per year, 5,000. Variable cost per unit is $3. The selling price per unit is $8, and they have a production of 2,000 pairs per year. And as I told you before, that break-even assumes that all the goods produced are sold, and of course this was one of the disadvantages. So now I have to draw it. The graph should look like this. Remember, in the exam there will be a graph for you. You want to draw, but you should know how to label it, and of course put the lines. So I'll go step by step. First, I have to label the x-axis will be the number of units. So here, units or pairs of shoes. And the y-axis will be the cost and revenue line. And of course, I need to take a scale before I draw the lines, and we know this from math. There is a table in your book that can summarize how to do this. Of course, I have to take value for x to find y. And remember the lines to draw. We have three main lines to draw on the break-even chart. I need to draw the fixed cost line and the total cost line and the revenue line. Variable cost could be drawn, but it's not relevant, so it won't be used. That's why we draw only three lines. So here I take different values for x. Usually we take 2 or 3. So let's say the first one is 0, and we take 2,000 units, for example. 2,000 is the maximum output produced by this business. So I say if the output is 0, my fixed cost will be 5,000. Why? Because as I said, fixed cost is the cost that the business has, regardless the amount of output, is the cost that stays the same. So it will be 5,000. And if it's 2,000, also 5,000. Now the variable cost is the cost that varies directly with output. So if I produce 0 shoes, there will be 0 cost. If I produce 2,000 units, as each unit costs me $3, so it will be 2,000 times 3, and this will give me 6,000. So now I can get the total cost out of these two. The total cost will be 5 plus 0, 5,000, and here 5 plus 6, 11,000. Still one more thing to draw or to fill is the revenue. And I know that the selling price per shoes is $8. So now if I sell 0, of course my revenue will be 0. And if I sell 2,000, my revenue will be 16,000. So 2,000 times 8 will give me 16,000. So now, after I get all these results, I can go back to my graph and draw it. I'll give you a hint in the exam to use. And this hint is simple because every time you face a break-even chart, every time you see a break-even chart question, immediately, even if they didn't ask, just use this rule, which is break-even point or contribution method rule. So as I said, it's a rule that can tell you immediately the break-even point. So there is no need to draw a table. It will take 1 minute to finish everything once you use this rule. So here, break-even point, as I know, it's the fixed cost divided by contribution, or selling price minus variable cost. So the fixed cost given 5,000 divided by 8 minus 3 equal 1,000 units. So now I know that the business should produce 1,000 pairs of shoes so that it makes no profit, no loss. So if I go back to my graph, I understand that there will be a point here somewhere, an intersection between the total cost and total revenue, because as I said, total cost equal total revenue, and that's what we call the break even. So now I start drawing the lines immediately. The fixed cost is simple. I have a fixed cost of 5,000 at any level of output. So the fixed cost will look like this. This is the fixed cost. Let me just change the color. Okay, so I label it, it's fixed cost. Okay, so remember, you have to label them because it's important. They give you marks for labeling. The second line that I have to draw is the total cost. And the total cost should always start from the fixed cost, because remember, there is always a fixed cost even if there is a zero production or zero sales. So it will start from here. So I know from the graph, or from the table that I had here, that for zero, total cost is 5,000. For 2,000 units, the total cost is 11,000. So I go back, I say, okay, for zero, it's 5,000. And for 2,000, which is the point here, the value will be 11,000. So let's assume it's here. Of course, in your paper will be clear. So I draw this line and I label it total cost. And now there's still one line to draw, which is the total revenue. Of course, it will start from zero, because if we sell zero items, the revenue will be zero. And I know from the table that 2,000 units will give me 16,000. So the 2,000 units will give me 16,000. So let's assume it's here. So now I draw the line. Let's say the line should be like this. Okay, and we call it total revenue. Now, as I know that the intersection of total cost and total revenue will be the break-even point. So I just draw dots and I see that it's 1,000. Using break-even point method, which is contribution method, will do the job, because I know already that the lines will intersect here and 1,000 will be the break-even point. So if I want to draw the lines, I can draw them easy. So it's very simple. I can draw one line and just intersect the line with the other. So now, for example, if I draw, let's say, the total revenue line, for example. So if we just go back and draw it again. So here I know that there will be an intersection somewhere that will be 1,000 as a break-even point. It's enough to draw one line only. So I can draw the total revenue line, let's say, like this, for example. After, of course, I know the information. And then the fixed cost line, or the total cost line, sorry, will be immediately drawn without looking, because I know already that they intersect here. So let it be like this. This is the total cost line. So that's why it's important to understand how to use the break-even point. Even if they didn't ask you, just do it on the scratch paper, and you will see that it will be really easy to calculate the break-even and to draw it. It will take 2 minutes in the exam. One more thing to explain on the break-even chart was the safety margin, as I said. Safety margin is very simple. They talk about it on page 230 in your book. Safety margin is simply the amount by which sales exceed the break-even point. So here, 2,000 units is the amount that the business sells per year, assuming that what we produce is sold. And the break-even point is 1,000. So we can say that the safety margin will be 2,000 minus the 1,000 will give me 1,000 units. So here, it simply means that the business is safe with 1,000 units. So Of course, this will tell me like I'm making profit of 1,000 only. Remember that this area here is the area of profit, and this area here is the area of loss. So if 1,000 units need to be produced so that total cost equal total revenue, if you produce less, you're making loss. If you produce more, you're making profit. Of course, the business wants to have less output to break even. So if the output to break even, let's say, is 500, it's better for the business because we have more units that will generate profit to the business. Okay, that's all for break-even chart and how to draw it. You can practice, of course, using past papers, and your book has some questions. If you have any questions, you can just ask me. And thank you for listening, and bye-bye.